After Paul talks about all the division in the church, in society, reminds them of Sosthenes, how much the gospel changed him, he then goes into this amazing speech. It runs from 1 Corinthians 1:17 down to 2 Corinthians 2:2. Okay? It's poetical in structure. If you read any technical commentary on Corinthians, they will say this is Paul's most poetical writing. Why? Well, he starts off in 1 Corinthians 17, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied with its power." And he sums it up in 2 Corinthians 2:2. Okay? "When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony of God, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." So in 1 Corinthians 1:17, he talks about his coming, the use of lofty words, the proclamation and the cross. And in 2 Corinthians 2:2, he talks about his coming, the use of lofty words, his proclamation and the cross. Can you see the repetition? And then right in the middle, okay, right slap bang in the middle, he says, "We preach Christ crucified as stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Greeks, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, is the power of God for the wisdom of God." So you have the cross at the beginning, you have the cross in the middle, you have the cross at the end. Now, I don't have time to expound the rest of it to you. You have 7 steps that go between 1 Corinthians 1:17 and that middle verse. Then you have 7 steps repeated in reverse order, reflecting exactly the same theological themes. You have the A, B, C, D of the coming and the lofty words, the preaching and the cross, and you have the same repetition at the end, the A, B, C, D. Okay, it has this beautiful structure to it, but let me read to you that middle verse in the Greek. Here's what he says. Okay? ήμεῖς κηρύσσομεν, Χριστὸν ἐσταυρωμένον, Ἰουδαίοις μεν σκάνδαλον, ἔθνεσιν μωρίαν. Now, did you hear it? It rhymes. That's why it's called Paul's most eloquent writing. As he's inspired by the Holy Spirit to write this infallible word, the guy breaks out into rhyming prose. He's a Hebrew thinker writing in Greek. They're 2 very different language structures. Do you know how amazing that is? Come on, look slightly impressed. It's impressive. But here's the point, otherwise we miss it. Because there's an irony, isn't there? Wait a minute. Doesn't Paul say he did not use eloquence and lofty words when he preached the gospel? And doesn't he repeat it in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 that he didn't use eloquent words and lofty things, speech? And here's the guy writing in rhyming verse. You ever thought about this before? It's fascinating, isn't it? What's the guy doing? Well, I wish I had time to explain it to you better, but the most famous speech in the ancient Greek world was written by a Roman general called Pericles. Now, he built the Parthenon, and Pericles led the Greeks to one of their greatest military victories against the barbarians. And the end of the first year of battle of the Peloponnesian War, I'm thinking of the translations trying to translate Peloponnesian War. Oh, right. Hey! Pericles leads this great victory, and the rulers of Athens are this is such a significant moment, they ask all of the great orators to come up with speeches. Well, my colleague Os Guinness, he studied oratory, and he had to read Pericles' speech. It was required reading for everyone at university who was interested in rhetoric. That speech was so famous. If you're English, if I were to say to you, "We will fight them on the beaches." How do you know that? I only gave you, "We will fight them." I gave you 4 words. And the answer is, well, every kid gets taught that in school, or at least they used to when we had proper education system. If you're American and I say 7 years ago, how do you know that? Well, it's one of the most famous speeches. It's short. Everybody knows that speech. Every Greek speaker knew Pericles' speech by heart. The speech was so moving, it made grown generals weep out loud. It was so moving, the government's the city officials ordered the speech to be repeated every year on the anniversary of this great victory. And every year it was repeated. And every year they'll pick some great orator to give it. Except, a few years later, Athens was destroyed by the barbarians. So this great eternal victory they had won actually proved to be empty. Now, Aristotle, writing on Pericles' speech, says, when I read Pericles' speech, it causes my spirit to soar like an eagle. I know it's not true, but, he says, the power of Pericles' rhetoric gives meaning to those words they don't otherwise have. That make sense? Okay, historically it's meaningless, but the rhetoric gives it power. Now, if you take Pericles' speech, and you take this speech of 1 Corinthians 1:17, there are 67 points of parallel between them, and that's far too many to be coincidental. He's writing to Greek speakers, remember. But see what Paul does. Paul makes it clear. The power of the gospel does not rely on eloquent and lofty words and being clever. It's not my speech that gives power to the gospel. Rather, it is the gospel which gives power to my speech. That's what he's saying here. Now, Paul is poetical. He's a poetical man. As the Holy Spirit falls on him, it doesn't obliterate his personality. God's Spirit is expressed through it. And it comes out like that. The great temptation in life is to rely on our own strength when it comes to preaching the gospel and then use God when we get stuck. Rather than allowing God to use us, make sense? And relying on his power. It is not you that gives power to the gospel. It is not your stories, your eloquence, your wisdom, your lofty words. If you rely on that, the preaching of the gospel will become vain. There is no compulsion in it, and it changes nothing.